Welcome to another Pharaoh stream where I'm going to be taking you through the best of the Royal Academy interwar art, starting off with 1920. Now, before we start, a few housekeeping things. This is the second attempt at going live. So if you can't, I'm going to post a comment here. Can you hear me? If anyone can hear me, please reply back, and I'm going to give this another go. But I've tested everything. I'm off mute. I'm in the system, so hopefully that would work. So just to recap what I'm trying to do here, it's a look at a year-by-year look through art at the Royal Academy, going through the Royal Academy illustrated books. I've selected what I think are the best pieces from each of the years. If you have just arrived, please take a look at the other videos that I've kind of got attached to this. That is the concept and the landscape. The concept video is going to take you through the idea behind the whole thing and the kind of philosophical reason why I've done this. And then the second video is all about the landscape. What are the big moments and pointers around this period to try and understand it in a little bit more detail and a little bit more context. So the way I've got this set up is I've got my highlights. It's roughly between 15 or 16 up to about 35 different pieces on a monthly basis, and we'll just go through as is. So I just want to start off with this piece here. This is by George Clausen. George Clausen was he's a landscape painter. He's also associated with the New English Art Club. He's born in 1852, so he was literally 68 at this point. And as you know, as you might guess, a lot of the RA artists are substantially older than you might think. That's because, you know, this is the premier artistic establishment in the UK. This is where the best of the best go. This is where the king chooses who's going to portray him, how the kind of the high-end elite of empire are going to choose. So it's all in all a very important establishment, but because of that, it tends to be a little bit older. Now, that being said, Clausen's actually responsible for putting in a number of reforms to try and make the selection process a little bit easier and to revivify it. And, you know, I think it's obvious that during the Edwardian era, the Royal Academy was missing out, and this was a new attempt to try and make the Royal Academy more relevant with current art. So again, we often think about the Royal Academy as this kind of stuffy old location of no interest, but they're making an attempt to make it more contemporary. So just let's talk about this piece a second. It's a beautiful hazy landscape. The sun is rising in the background. Obviously, a rural setting. The piece itself is called "The Village Inn, Misty Morning," and you know, the painting itself is very, very loosely painted. There's almost no detail on the woman down across here. You can see these little white specks representing ducks or chickens, maybe, and there's the shadow, the kind of mere ghost of a horse and cart across there, giving us the impression that something could be there. But what I love about this painting is that it really typifies and captures for me what the English, the kind of English countryside experience is like. And you can still experience this today. Out of all of the weather conditions in my mind, mist is one that is exceptionally interesting because, and also sums up England as well. You know, mysterious Albion, this kind of wall and hazy barrier that's kind of ethereal at the same time. So it's a really beautiful laid out, really captures interest, and I thought that's a good starter for this work. Now we're going to be on a bit of a landscape spree right now. We've got the next piece, which is by Sidney Lee. Sidney Lee, I actually first knew about him as a wood engraver. There's a very famous woodcut that he has done of a bridge similar to the famous Hokusai Bridge, the one that Van Gogh copied as well. But actually, his oil paintings are still really well respected, and actually this is what he was known for at the time. And having spent some time with some of his oil work, I find it really inspiring and actually some of the best landscape pieces of the time. Now, this piece compared to Clausen is very, very different. Clausen's about mood and this mystery and this haziness, while Lee is about detail. It's about like age and roughness and power at the same time. A lot of the subjects that he chooses feature kind of rocks or rockiness, mountains, powerful ruins and structures. There is this kind of like mysterious solidarity and fortitude to all of his works, with water running down at the same time. This piece is exceptionally well detailed. You know, each of the rock strata is kind of laid out really nicely. So it's a very different piece, but one I think that kind of captures interest very well as well. Lee is only 54 at this time. So I know it sounds ridiculous, but one of the younger boys exhibiting here. And Lee would go on to have a very successful career for many years. I think Clausen actually died the year after this. So, you know, he's on the way out. Lee is more like what we'll go and see. Now, the third of our little trio of introductory landscapes is from Julius Olson. Now, he, in my mind, typifies kind of classic seaside landscape painters. Turner obviously spent a lot of time, I think it's in the Kent coast. Olson is based in Cornwall, and people might be familiar with some of the St Ives painters. He is kind of like a pioneer, marking out Cornwall as the place to go for landscape. He is kind of one of the fathers of that like that school, ended up mentoring many of them. And, you know, he mainly paints these kind of maritime pieces, seascapes, boats, beaches. And again, I think each of these are very different. I mean, Olson is the most almost impressionistic out of these three artists. You can see there's really not much to the work, really. But one thing we are missing out is the scale of these pieces. Olson would often paint them exceptionally large. And so, you know, we're just looking through a monitor and a screen right now. We can't really gauge the sheer magnitude and power of the works. But I still really like it. This piece is called Summer Moon, Cornish Coast. The rough waves of the sea battering into the Cornwall coast here. We've got the moon obscured, hidden beneath the clouds, but kind of still penetrating through, lighting up the surface of the sea with this dappled yellow. And then maybe in the distance, maybe it's a lighthouse or some kind of boat or something across there, also being a point of interest. So it's moody, it's dramatic. Again, very different to the other artists we've seen, and I really like it. Again, Olson's only 56 at this time, and you're going to see a lot of his work over the next couple of years. Now, long time followers of the channel may be familiar with William Strang. Strang is very famous for some of his exceptionally disturbing First World War portraits of the trenches, of gassings, and also his career as, quite frankly, as like a grotesque occult painter in his own right. But interestingly, he's a little bit older, 61 at this time now, and he is also producing these portraits as a way of kind of maintaining and giving himself a living. And what you tend to find is that the Royal Academy is a bit of a place where some of the older artists will go out to pasture and sort of retire from some of their kind of more creative work and turn to portraiture as this kind of like cash cow. And especially in the wake of like I said, Sargent and the wave of society paintings that happened. If you weren't anybody, if you didn't have a society portrait in your house. And I think it's worth keeping Sargent in mind when looking at this painting here by Strang, because it's very, very different. Sargent, some people insultingly call him a bit of a face painter. He absolutely knocked them out. And because of that, he would often just do the face and everything else would be super light. You can see that Strang is the opposite of that. He is all about detail. He's about sumptuous textiles, but also he just captures the mood of the model really nicely. And actually, this isn't a society portrait. It's almost kind of like he's putting his tent out and showing his skills and what he can do. The piece is called The Feather Fan, and you can see she's holding the fan across here. But the setup itself is kind of interesting. He's got the model 3/4 view, looking away from the viewer. The fan held up vertically, and there's a lot of verticals in this. He's actually got almost the entire the woman in the picture, so almost down to her knees. So you have a sense of a length in the piece, which matches up with the fan here. I was going back to those kind of textiles. He's got several different textiles kind of wrapped around the woman, giving all of this detail and interest. And I think most interestingly of all is the face, where there is this composure, nobility, strength, but there's also an undertoned sense of melancholy to the piece as well, where she's kind of looking out, and there's a kind of a sadness to it as well. So quite mysterious, very, very interesting. Let's go on to the next piece, and this is something we will have seen before on the channel, which is Orpen's piece, which is called The Signing of a Peace in the Hall of Mirrors, which is the famous wall painting where they're kind of capturing the moment of the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, where you've got the Allied powers across here, representatives of France and Britain, as well as even Japan down here in the corner. And for me, this piece is really interesting in a number of ways, because yes, it's a historical piece, it's a war piece. It is, in some ways, the fact that it was commissioned is interesting, because is this a piece of propaganda? You could say, well, there is a level of this, but Orpen's an interesting character where he was part of the military, very military adjacent. He was in the war. He spent time there, so he has the credentials. He's not an outsider by any means. And I think the impression I get from it and from reading around is that he was actually quite sick of some of the people, some of the politicians, and he described them as kind of vain and greedy, which I quite like. The piece itself the composition is kind of interesting, because you've got all of them down here at the bottom, all of the kind of weight of the people. But actually, the majority of the canvas takes up the room, and with us looking to the heavens. And actually, he's done a bit of a trompe l'oeil on the perspective here, where the perspective is straight on, but it tends to sort of bend up. There's a bit of a kind of a fisheye lens here, so you can see a little bit of the roof at the same time. The little there's also a little tag at the top there, which says "Le Roi gouverne par lui-même," which means the king governs alone. And again, there's an interesting selection for that. Obviously, it is authority that governs, and here is the authority of the world forcing their dreadful terms upon the Germans. But I think there is this kind of again reflection on earthly versus heavenly here, with the kind of gold and the complicated roof. And the eye is constantly drawn to that over the kind of grubby politicians. So I think they commissioned him expecting like a big glorification of them, but actually I think quite subtly Orpen has put them in their place, heavily rooted on the earth, and then the bottom in the bottom part of the painting, and it's a reflection on authority and power, really. Let's just one little factoid with this. It was the most expensive commissioned painting of the First World War, and he was paid £3,000. And for comparison, Sargent was only paid 300 for his much larger painting, Gast, which is the famous one with the soldiers lined up behind each other. Okay, on to the next piece, and this is Shannon's The Childhood of Bacchus. Now, one thing that keeps becoming apparent as I go through the artists at this period is actually they're focusing, certainly on the kind of academic circuit, they're focusing on the so-called old masters, with a lot of interest in kind of 17th century Rome, for example, and Velasquez is often mentioned, and some of the Dutch painters. So it's interesting how this piece has been kind of pulled together, which is, the Childhood of Bacchus is a fundamentally like neoclassical piece. It's 17th century. There's a couple of other examples I've seen, which are, I think there's like 1640 or something like that. So that it's a historical theme, but it does have a bit of a modern treatment to it at the same time. Now, if we actually have a look at the kind of composition, there's almost two halves of this. On the right-hand side, we've kind of got the kind of heavenly piece. We've got the little chubby Bacchus here being delivered to the earth by Mercury, and he's being surrounded by these happy putti floating in the air. And then on the left-hand side, we've kind of got these adorating women, his the Bacchanids. And it's hard to tell from the picture, but I think this looks to me like a kind of a grape branch being pulled down in honor of his arrival. In the background, there's a little bit of business with the kind of stags looking on, so there's a bit of a kind of eye focus. Overall, it's an interesting piece. It doesn't blow me away, but again, it's interesting to see what they're kind of focusing on at the time. Shannon himself started in Lincoln, but trained at the Lambeth School, which again I think is one of the most important innovations of the late 19th century. A lot of the new sculpture guys went through there. They adopted a very French style of teaching. Shannon was also closely associated with Charles Ricketts, who is an influential critic and artist in his own right, and we'll see some of his work as we go through the years as well. One thing I think we're missing out here, I think, is the colours. And Shannon is famous for his love of the Venetians, and the Florentines were known as being the masters of design. The Venetians were known as being masters of colour. Just a note on these pictures. For all of the images I chose, I went through and took a photo of them from the book, from the various books. And then I looked to see if I could find a color version of it. And if I couldn't, I've just used the black and whites from the individual image. So apologies for that. The other thing to note is obviously I started in 1920. The reason for that is I had to buy individual books, which is over 15. I got from 1920 to 1935, and I just couldn't find or buy or afford numbers 18 and 19 for love nor money. So if you want to throw me some cash, I'll go back and record those after the effect. Okay, that's the end of the Shannon piece here. Now let's go back to Strang again, and what's great about this is we can see Strang in color here, and this piece is Barbara Morley Holder. So this is a society picture, and shows a number of things to me. I think firstly, another really kind of melancholy, interesting, deep portrait piece. They've got her sitting down. They've got there's they've got some really interesting colors at the same time. And the she's sort of looking off into the distance. There's a bit of a smile on her face, a little bit of interest. But in my opinion, it's her hands that is where the action is at the same time. Where there's tension inside her, there's interest, and I think that's where he's tried to put a bit of emphasis in there. Going back to the colors again, there's obviously three major notes, this kind of beautiful dual tones, green, red, and silver. And I think it's a really lovely selection, really, really unique. And it's a shame we didn't have the fan one in color, but I'm a big fan of Strang's portraits. I don't know if I mentioned, but he basically dies the next year. So this is the kind of last of his work. Now let's move on to some sculptural pieces here. This is by Edgar Bertram McKennell. One of the famous, I think Australia's best artist. Born in Melbourne in 1863, he is, in my mind, fully associated with the New Sculpture Group, and they tended to operate between 1880 to 1910. So, I think Gilbert, Alfred Gilbert, died around the wartime or just after the war. So I think the kind of main leader of the group, his star had already gone out, and I think McKennell lived on. There's a few other guys you'll see who were going to capture this kind of last end moment. And McKennell does some really brilliant pieces. His Circe, for example, is very, very famous. You'll have definitely seen that beforehand. And this is a sculpture for a memorial. And it's the piece is called Statue in Bronze, erected by the Canadian Red Cross. So I think this is, it's a colonial statue. So that's what they've used, a kind of colonial artist. McKennell got a bit of fame in about 86, and then moved across to London and was kind of producing big commissions from there. And war memorials are difficult because I think you can get too much into a vein of here's like a maudlin looking soldier, or here's like a sad angel kind of thing. And I think this is an attempt at a more positive view. Well, I think positives are maybe the wrong word here. At a more glorious view and a kind of a celebration of the life as opposed to sadness. And you've got this kind of tagline underneath. They are at peace. God provided them and found them worthy for himself. And I was thinking, who is the woman that we're seeing across there with her arms outreached? And in my mind, it has to be an allegory for peace, opening her arms for the souls of the dead here. And because of that, there is this kind of glorious triumphancy to it at the same time. There is a sadness to it, but there is a nobility at the same time. And he's got this kind of quite simple garb, a robe, which drops straight down. This isn't about the kind of sensuousness of the fabric or womanhood, but it's about it's partly about showing technical detail with the fabric, but also creating this strength to her form and bulking her up as a volume. But I really like it as a war memorial, quite different to what we've seen, what you might have seen elsewhere. All right, the next piece is by Spencer Watson. This is The Three Wise Kings. And of course, it's one of our first theological pieces, recalling the moment that Jesus, where Jesus was born, and there was the Magi as well. Now, there's a few interesting things about. In fact, maybe I'll talk about Spencer Watson firstly. He was mainly known as a portrait painter, described as being influenced by the Italian Renaissance and Romanticism. So this is not one of his normal paintings. I'm not sure how much I would personally hold with that kind of saying he was influenced by the Renaissance and Romanticism in his other works. But anyway, he's 58 at this moment. So again, he's old, but not that old. And the piece for me, I think, is really interesting because he's placed it in a slightly different setting. You know, there isn't this kind of um, cheesy chocolate box stable. It is there is hints at a stable, and you can see maybe like an animal here on the right hand side in the hay, but it mainly looks like they're in part of some kind of jagged cave system. And again, that there's a kind of a roughness to it and a rudeness to the cave, which gives a lot of texture and makes the piece very interesting. You've got the Virgin Mary across here in her deep blue, which again is a slightly different color tone to the usual blue that's used. Joseph in the background is in a green, and then the three richly colored wise men across here. I mean, I really love the cave setting. I think it's really novel and really interesting. But for me, what's particularly strong is the color palette that he uses. You can see basically like this muted blue, muted green, muted red. Here, the reds across here from kind of the stain in the rocks, or the kind of the succulents or whatever they are, reflected in the in the wise men. And it creates this very interesting, again, this kind of dual tone palette. Now, I also wanted to kind of point out the outfits of the Magi. I mean, they look very noble. They are completely transfixed on Jesus, yeah, and I think there is an intensity, like almost kind of like a stoic marveling of the people, of the men. But also, I love their fabrics that they've got as well. So you can see this is a lovely atlas silk that he's wearing, showing that kind of Eastern exoticism. But if you have a look at this middle king, I think this looks like a Vanessa Bell designed Omega Workshop, like modernist textile. I'm not 100% sure about this, but it looks very similar to some of Bell's other works. And I don't know if this was like a little joke by Shannon, but I sort of think it works so well color scheme wise. You can see the blues, reds, and greens reflected in it, but it has this kind of almost Eastern exoticism to it, which matches and fits the piece really well. But I really love this. Very, very unique, very interesting, really well rendered. But again, has these little modernist touches as well as part of it. I mean, talking about modernism in general is difficult because it means different things to different people. There's an argument to say that anyone creating work between like 1910 and 1930 are early modernists in some ways, like even if they wouldn't describe themselves as that. So again, all of these Royal Academy members would not. They would describe themselves as academic, as opposed to the kind of fringe Slade upstarts. But you can see it in the work and some of the kind of decisions they've gone for in terms of the pieces. So I think there are these kind of little modernist elements even in what is like quite a classically rendered academic painting, but definitely something a little bit different from Spencer Watson here. If you check out the rest of his work, I really like this. I think it really captured me. Okay, I mentioned about artists going out to pasture again, and Frank Dixie, in my mind, is another one who perfectly fits that bill. Dixie, super famous for some of his PRB inspired, like he's kind of like third wave, pre-Raphaelite, really, like after Burne-Jones. There's a very famous Percival that he does, for example. But by the 1920s, I think he knows that PRBism and kind of Gothicism is over, and most of his work at the RA seems to revolve around portraiture. And I think Dixie's interesting because he has almost like a second life as a really good portraitist for society women, and he's really well known and does some quite big, quite famous people as well. Very unique style, very interesting. It's kind of like, what if? Because that's the one thing that's interesting about the PRB, really, is that they don't do portraiture. The closest you might say is someone like Rossetti, who constantly comes back to May Morris or something like that. But anyway, back to Dixie. He is a really old boy. He's 67 at this time. Very, very famous in his own regard. But I really I really like his portraits, and the reason why is he often has his sitters sitting down, so there's a kind of a casualness to them. But then he elevates them with some of the textures and textiles that he's using. Lots of these kind of see-through silks, organzas, floating lace that is draped across the bodies of these society beauties, and he creates these very soft, dappled pieces that has a strong ethereal quality to them. And I think you can see her hair kind of almost fading across in the background. The piece is fully rendered. This is not a Sargent-esque impressionistic style piece. It's very well. There's a lot of detail. I mean, look at the handwork, really nice. But she's kind of floating across. You know, we've captured this moment. There's a book on the side on her kind of Liberty Moroccan-esque side table. She's just finished reading. She's sitting by the fire, and looking beautiful and peaceful in a moment of calm in her house. One thing I wanted to say about the sitters as well. One thing you'll notice is that, again, I think often we look back at late Empire and say, it's this ossified old structure, and very, very kind of like ugly in the kind of Habsburgian chin kind of way, and it's just obvious through the models and the sitters that they're very, very beautiful, youthful, and charming as well. And she's got this lovely long Norman aristocratic face as well, and there's a very definite type, body type and face type that you'll see time and time again. Okay, time for something totally different here. This is by Richard Jack. He's born in Sunderland, studied in New York. Again, not too old, 55 while doing this, but this is a really interesting. It's actually, I think this is the only piece by Jack that I've got in any of the that I'll have in any of the streams. This really individual work that really caught me. It's called The Passing of the Chieftain, and it's part like historicism, part romantic, part impressionistic piece. In fact, I would maybe even say something like it's like something out of Galen Kallela or something like that, who often has these kind of like historical pieces, but there's kind of like a mysticism to it. But this is much more impressionistic in its rendering. And when I saw it in black and white, instantly jumped out at me in terms of its power. Now, what's interesting about it, power-wise, it has this kind of static, pent-up energy that's almost gothic. I often talk about how classicism relies on this dynamic energy. It's the movement of the body. It is the discus thrower, the throwing of the lightning, or something like that. It is the wrestler. While Gothicism is all about the pent-up energy. It is the shield wall. It is the knight holding a sword in a defense guard or something like that. And you see some of that static power in these figures across here. They are physically strong, but there is also strength in them, and you can feel them slowly moving across. They're not dynamic figures, but they still have this reverential vitality to them at the same time. Look at their heads are down, but their spears are in their hands pointing forward. You've got the kind of procession behind of the items. The chieftain is elevated to almost it's almost kind of like a ritual or a deification of the chieftain himself. We've got to talk about the colors here as well. It's all the values are absolutely wild here. You've got the practically white in the background here for the sky, and practically black beneath. So again, it's about light and darkness, a reflection on life and death itself. And also maybe asking the question about what's happening next to the life of the chieftain. One last thing, I just love the kind of grog-esque nature of the holders here. They've got these kind of. I feel like the arms are particularly long, or I don't know if it's the foreshortening for this character, or whatever. But the arms seem super long, so they almost look Neanderthal-like, but very powerful at the same time. So yeah, brilliant brilliant one-off piece there by Jack. Okay, let's move on to this piece by Glyn Philpott. It is called The Rice Family, and it's like a semi self-portrait here by Philpott. Now, I mentioned about how the Academy was trying to reform at this period. It's not just a band of old geezers. They were trying to spot artists that wanted to paint or like derived from academic painting, but also wanted to um, um, like do something new and interesting. And I feel that they identified Philpott as one potential great artist. And again, I think it's such a shame because I think Philpott is one of the underrated artists of Britain, basically. He's only 36 when he did this. So again, he is one of the youngest guys exhibiting at the show across here. But this piece is all about him. It's almost kind of like meta because it's him and his family doing a portrait of his mother. Here's Glyn here on the right hand side. But obviously he's kind of painting it in the third person, so he's painting himself at the same time. The piece itself isn't that mind-blowing. I think it's just, a very well rendered piece of like naturalistic art. There's a bit of dynamicism on Glyn himself, a bit of like stylistic choices on the face, for example, that you can zoom in and see that marks it out. But I think what you got to understand, like the reason why I wanted to include this was to kind of show the beginnings of Glyn, and as we go through the period, you can see how his style dramatically changes. But just in the same way that Picasso could really paint, Glyn can really paint as well when he wants to. And again, look at the sumptuousness of the silks across here, really beautiful. I mean, this is all about the mother in this piece. She's almost become this iconic holy figure. Yes, she's been painted by the sons, but it's kind of like almost like an act of worship at the same time. There's so much focus on them, but we're sort of brought back to reality with this other brother across here having tea and a slice of bread. There is a bit of kind of like working class or just like like everydayness to the painting that's been brought in at the same time. Forgot to mention that Philpott was another Lambeth School of Art boy as well. So really interesting figure. Keep an eye on him. Now, I mentioned in my landscape video that Gothic was dead. Well, that's not quite true because there are a few Gothic paintings before. Oh, sorry, someone in chat has just asked, I've never heard the Time Society portrait before. What does that mean? In the Victorian period, society basically meant upper middle class and high society. So if you know anything about the British, we're obsessed with, or we were obsessed with class. And if you were in the upper echelons of that class, you would be known as a part of society at the same time. So a society portrait is a portrait from someone in that society. Okay, going back to this piece. This is an obvious piece of historicism. It's entitled The Forerunner, but it's basically all about Da Vinci presenting his works to the Duke of Milan, the Schwarzer, across here on the right-hand side. I mean, we're immediately brought back to someone like Leighton's work. If you've seen there's the presenting of the icon in Florence, which is a large piece at the V&A, similar format, historical painting, lots of different figures. And I think the Bricktail does a pretty good job here with the piece. But I mean, ultimately, it's a little bit cheesy at the same time, so I don't think it's the most amazing work that's there. So nice, but not the best. This piece is a little bit interesting. It's by a guy called Oswald Moser. That's Moser. And it's called the Scenes from the Tales of Risho the Dwarf. And it's basically about this kind of drunken dwarf. I tried to find out more information about the actual piece itself, but I couldn't find it. I wonder whether it was like a made-up motif at the same time. But I like the novelty of the roundel format and the rendering itself. Yes, it is medievalism, but you can tell from the painting that it's done in like a more modernist style. There's more kind of like realism as part of it. And I think it's just quite an entertaining and interesting piece. It's not just your standard Pre-Raphaelite-esque Gothicism. Although I'd have loved to know a little bit more about the actual scene itself. Okay, we're on to Drury now, a very famous new sculpture guy. And again, he is 64 at this time, so again, almost past it. But this is a really lovely portrait of Glenn, I think it's Glenn Coates. Yeah, the late Lady Glenn Coates. Now, Drury, I would say, is one of the best renderers of women as part of the new sculpture guys. Does some really lovely sculptures outside of Leeds. Leeds Town Hall I've seen in person that are very, very powerful. But we've got this lovely portrait here. I often think that bust portraits are really boring and dull, and it's much harder to showcase the essence of the character and the interest of a character in a bust. But I think he's managed to capture some real interest in her eyes, in her expression. There is nobility, youth, interest, but also a penetrating inquisition in her and what she does at the same time. And I thought that was a really nice piece by Drury. A little bit about herself. She is married to the director of a thread making firm who used to own J&P Coats. So an old captain of industry and a well-known liberal at the same time. Great. So on to another, like what I think is one of the more important pieces of work at this year's show, and it's done by a guy called Harry Morley. Now Morley is 39 by this time period. Again, he actually studied architecture first, then moved across to study art, spending time importantly in France. And it's obvious that France in the tens is important for the avant-garde, whatever, Macubists, etc. But it's also important for what we call today this kind of Art Nouveau style, or sorry, Art Deco style, or what I call sculptural modernism. Specifically, the so-called Bordeaux school featuring Dupas. They're constantly referenced here. But what's interesting about Morley is that he's not trained in Bordeaux. He doesn't work with Dupas, but produces basically Deco-esque works. So again, there's sculptural modernism here. Now, the actual piece itself is the death of Hyacinthus, and I believe this story is all about